Next up, we've got an actual speaker with something substantive to say, and that first speaker is Chris French. He is, let me say that with my teeth in, Chris French. He is Emeritus Professor and Head of the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit at Goldsmiths. His main area of research is the psychology of paranormal beliefs and anomalous experiences. He frequently appears on radio and television, casting a sceptical eye over paranormal claims. And his talk is The Terror That Comes in the Night. And he will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of Q&A. Give it up, please, for Chris French.
Thank you very much. Nick, I thought you were joking when you said you could do a 3-hour talk on postcodes, but you could, couldn't you? That was great, actually. I really enjoyed that. Right. Just before I start, how many of you, I mean, I know you're not a typical audience because you're nerds. How many of you had actually heard of sleep paralysis before you decided to come along tonight? So, all right, better question. How many of you hadn't heard of sleep paralysis? So most of you had, in fact. Okay, that's interesting. Because I mean, I think it's one of those things that, again, I think a nerdy audience may well have heard of sleep paralysis. Non-nerdy audiences, less so. Anyway, the clicker is working, I believe. Yes, excellent. Right, so I'm going to be talking about the terror that comes in the night. This is the title of a book by David Hufford, an anthropologist who wrote one of the best books around on sleep paralysis that really got people interested in it. I'm going to start with a couple, well, 3 actual examples. I mean, I'd prefer to just stand here for my 20 minutes and just read these first-hand accounts because they're so creepy. People who know that I'm interested in this kind of weird stuff send me these first-hand accounts. The first one I've got here is from somebody who's actually here tonight. Hi, Sarah. This is a time when she was living in a flat in Catford, living on her own in that flat, and this is an extract from an account she sent me. A figure came in, tall and hunchbacked, wearing a long black hooded cloak. He didn't have a face, but the space where the face should have been seemed to kind of glow a dark green. He seemed to be larger than life size, perhaps around 7 or 8 feet tall, but hunched over. Even though I couldn't see his face, I felt that he probably did have a face and would have looked similar to those characters in an episode of Buffy, which aired in 1999 when I was 13. Now, these are the characters. A slide that you saw earlier, that wasn't me. That was this guy. They're Chris French above this picture. Yeah, thanks. Anyway, this guy's kind of one of the gentlemen who, I must confess, I'd never actually was into Buffy, but I looked this up on YouTube, and yes, he's a really, really creepy, nasty piece of work. She goes on, the figure stopped at the side of my bed, which is a low platform bed, so he leaned right over me, possibly hovering in the style of the gentleman, that's what they were called in the Buffy series, and let out this god-awful shrieking noise, which lasted for what felt like about 30 seconds, perhaps longer, in one long stream. It was a sort of deep, guttural sound. I felt like it was imprinted on my brain, and I could hear it for days and days afterwards. Now, Sarah is kind of fortunate in one sense, insofar as that's the only episode of sleep paralysis she's ever had, and who'd want another one after that? But I'll give you another couple of examples. This is one from one of my students a few years back, Katie Haley. She had episodes on a regular basis. I'm lying on my bed, in my bed, with my eyes seemingly open and feeling just as I would if I were awake. I can see that my bedroom door is open, and I try to turn my head to focus more clearly, but I am unable to move. It is at this point that I begin to sense some sort of presence beyond the bedroom door. I'm straining in order to see what is coming, and then she appears. She has wild reddish hair and is short in stature. She seems to glide across the floor, dragging her feet as she moves. I'm terrified. I still cannot move, and I know that she is going to try to kill me. She reaches the bed and climbs up onto my chest. She puts her hand around my neck and starts to strangle me. This is the old hag who often appears in episodes of sleep paralysis. Inspired lots of artists. This is just one artistic representation. There's loads and loads of others if you go on the internet. At this point, there's no doubt in my mind that the situation is real. She is really strangling me, and I feel the pressure of her hands around my neck. I cannot move. And then all of a sudden, I wake up. But it's so difficult to remain awake that I immediately fall asleep again. And then the process is repeated again and again, sometimes up to 12 times in one night. And this is from a student. She used to have these episodes kind of about once a month. And being a good scientist, she kind of, is it connected to my menstrual cycle? No, she'd rule that one out. But she said she could feel in the days before it started to happen that it was going to happen. And then it would happen, and then it would build up again slowly. British 35-year-old academic psychologist. These days, it's pretty much always the same. It's when I'm going off to sleep. I never have them in the middle of the night. I never have them waking up, always when I'm going off to sleep. What happens is my eyes are open, and usually I get the sense that something in the room is happening. So it's more like apprehension. It's a sort of belief that something's going to go off. And then a shape gathers, a sort of small black cloud gathers, and it's the devil, a monster. And it comes onto me, and I can feel its weight. And basically, the belief is that it's holding me, and that it's going to drag me down into an abyss. I can feel sensations on my body. It's multisensory. I can sort of smell it too. I feel sensations in my body like a lift. And again, as I say, lots of artistic representations, these kind of demons that people see sitting on top of them. I feel like I'm going down. I can't move, certainly. Well, I try, but it never works. Usually all I can do is to make a kind of hum in my throat and try to make a feedback cycle, make that louder. As it gets louder, the more awake I get, the more I can do until I eventually perhaps shout, and that wakes me up, properly wakes me up. So that's just 3 examples. I've got dozens and dozens of these, and you know, even though these are people who recognize what's happening, they know it's this thing called sleep paralysis. They're still kind of terrifying accounts because people are really experiencing this. So, okay, so what are the general symptoms of sleep paralysis? Well, as the name implies, it's an inability to move. It's in a state between sleep and wakefulness, either as you're going into sleep or coming out of sleep. Now, on its own, in its most basic form, it's kind of relatively common. There'll be lots of people in this room who will have experienced it, and that is literally it. It's a kind of, you kind of either wake up or you go to sleep, you realize you can't move. It lasts a few seconds and you kind of snap out of it, and it's a bit disconcerting, but it's kind of no big deal. You think, oh, that was a bit weird. But you might get some of these associated symptoms that make it a lot scarier. As we saw in a couple of the examples there, you get a sense of presence. Even if you can't see anything or hear anything, you get the sense that something is in the room with you, and it means you no good whatsoever. You might get hallucinations. You might hear voices or footsteps or mechanical sounds. You might see lights moving around the room, or dark shadows, or monstrous figures, or demons. You might get tactile hallucinations. You might feel as if there's something breathing on the back of your neck, but you can't move. It's absolutely terrifying. There's difficulty breathing, there's a sense of pressure on the chest, and a feeling that you're being strangled, as we heard in that account. And maybe totally understandably, given all this, intense fear. But there's kind of good reason to believe that this is actually probably an integral part of the whole experience, that it's the amygdala, the part of the brain that deals with fight or flight, that's overactivated. Because people report, even if people who've been in genuine life-threatening situations in everyday life, report that the fear that they feel during sleep paralysis is orders of magnitude greater than that. It's like nothing they've ever experienced. So if you have the underlying susceptibility, you're more likely to actually experience an episode of sleep paralysis if you sleep on your back, if you are in unfamiliar surroundings, and if your regular sleep pattern has been disrupted in some way. It typically lasts between a few seconds, but it can last for a few minutes. It can even go on for a kind of 20 minutes, which obviously would be pretty scary. And as we've seen, it can be repeated several times in one night. Now, if you do a talk on sleep paralysis, you are contractually obliged to show this picture. It's a great picture. It's by Henry Fuseli. It's a very popular picture back in the 1700s called A Nightmare. And it is obviously an image of sleep paralysis. You've got this kind of weird horse peering through the drapes. You've got the demon on the chest. So you've got the difficulty breathing and so on and so forth. And as I've already mentioned, you are more likely to have an episode of sleep paralysis if you sleep on your back than in any other position. But to be honest, if you sleep in that position, you're just asking for trouble. I mean, that's just ridiculous. How common is it? The best estimates we've got are from a meta-analysis by a friend of mine, Brian Sharpless. He looked at all of the rates vary enormously from one study to another, from literally a fraction of a percentage point up to 65% of the population. That's quite a wide range. But the best estimate based on Brian's paper, in the general population, getting on for 8%, around about 1 in 12 people will experience it once in their lifetime at least. But there are two groups that stand out as being around about 30%, and that's psychiatric patients and students, which actually makes sense in light of what I said before. If you've got the underlying susceptibility, a disrupted sleep pattern is more likely to actually make it happen, and there are two groups that would have that. We did a survey ourselves of a general UK population, not psychiatric patients or students only, and we actually found a much higher rate of 30%. Now, I don't know if that's real or it's a fluke or whatever, but around about the same time, there was another survey of the UK population, a documentary which is very well worth watching called The Nightmare, which is about sleep paralysis, also got a similar rate. So whether there really are differences between different countries, for whatever reason, I don't know. But anyway, I thought that was quite interesting. In terms of what explains sleep paralysis, we do have the kind of, in general terms, we do understand what's going on here. In a normal night's sleep, you go through various stages. You start off awake, you go through stage 1 sleep, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. I think recently these have been more or less merged, but that doesn't really matter. And then you go back. Now, as you go through these different stages, your heart rate changes, your breathing rate, your brain waves change. They're very easy to identify, really clear differences. And then you come back up again. This takes about 90 minutes. And then you go into what's called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And that's the phase of sleep that is typically associated with vivid dreams. Now, normally, as I say, this would be a normal night's sleep. And obviously, after going through a few of these 90-minute cycles, you wake up and you get up. Sleep paralysis seems to be particularly associated with going directly from being awake into one of these REM periods. Now, we know that during these REM periods, the muscles of your body are actually paralyzed, presumably to stop you acting out the actions of the dream. But putting it simply, something happens here where your mind wakes up, but your body doesn't. You can move your eyes. That's one part of your body you still can move. So you can see that you're in your bedroom. You can see your surroundings, but you can't move. And you've got all this weird dream imagery coming through into normal waking consciousness. So sleep paralysis is like an intermediate state of consciousness. It's a kind of hybrid between normal waking consciousness and REM sleep. And that's even supported by EEG data. On your right there, you've got an actual EEG spectrum as recorded during sleep paralysis. And this is a kind of combination for the same person of their non-sleep paralysis REM and their normal waking consciousness. And you can see that they're very, very similar. So it's this intermediate state of consciousness. In terms of the underlying neurobiology, some analysis suggests that you've got kind of 3 main factors that tend to crop up during sleep paralysis. One of these is kind of referred to as intruder. The kind of the sense of presence, the kind of hallucinations of somebody in the room and so on and so forth. This is somewhat speculative, but this might be a result of as I mentioned before, the overactive amygdala. The amygdala deals with monitoring the environment for threats. And the idea is that it's overactivated. There is no actual threat here, so it's almost as if the mind supplies one by supplying some kind of hallucination of something that corresponds to a threat. You've got the incubus factor, the pressure on the chest, the feeling that there is something there, or you may be being strangled or whatever. Now, normally, your breathing, like you've not really thought much about your breathing, have you, so far? Let's face it. You've all been breathing quite happily, involuntarily. That just happens. If I say to you now, okay, on 3, take a deep breath in. You could do that. You can take voluntary control of your breathing. Normally, you don't ever do that. You don't think about it. During sleep paralysis, the automatic breathing process carries on, but you can no longer take voluntary control of your breathing. And so when you're in this terrifying situation and you kind of expect to take a deep breath in, it doesn't happen. And that is translated into a feeling of being strangled or something pressing on you. And then finally, you've got this unusual bodily experiences. People sometimes this can even turn into a full-blown out-of-body experience, which is another talk. But basically, this is down to kind of overactivation of the areas of the brain that deal with putting together all the input that relates to your bodily position and so on and so forth, all being disrupted, and your mind doing the best to try and make sense of that. Now, one of the things that really fascinates me about sleep paralysis is when you get the same core experience occurring in different parts of the world, different cultures. So I mean, this is just a sample of hundreds of different words around the world to describe this experience. In Newfoundland, they talk about the old hag who comes and sits on the sleeper's chest and tries to throttle them. In China, they talk about ghost oppression. In Japan, it's kanashibari, which literally translates as bound by iron. It's one of my favourites in St. Lucia. It's Kokmar. It's the spirits of unbaptized children that crawl onto the sleeper's chest and try to throttle them. So do sleep well tonight, all of you, won't you? In Europe in the Middle Ages, it was the incubus and the succubus. Again, like I said before, Carla McKinnon is an artist I work with who's produced these amazing illustrations. She's also, if you want to know more, go and type Devil in the Room into Google when you get home. She made a short animated film about her own sleep paralysis experiences, which is really good. But the old hag, kanashibari. This is the incubus, the male form, who would come in the night. This is the succubus. To be honest, I don't know which of the two of them is the more shocked. It's very hard to say. There's evidence from going back that certain kind of accusations of witchcraft were based on sleep paralysis episodes. And it seems to be a factor when it comes to alien abduction claims. If you have ever had these kinds of experiences, then a natural thing to think is, particularly if you're one of the, it's a small minority of the population who get the really vivid form on a regular basis. But if you are one of those poor unfortunates, and you don't know there's a scientific and medical literature on this thing called sleep paralysis, you're quite likely to think, well, either I'm going crazy, or something weird really is happening to me. So if you then read books by self-professed ufologists who say, have you ever woken up in the night and found that you couldn't move with a sense of presence and weird lights moving around the room, you've been abducted by aliens. And they've wiped your memory for the rest of the event. And this is what they actually claim. And a lot of people are taken in by it. At last, they've got an explanation for these weird experiences they've had over the years. So, you know, it is a factor in a lot of alien abduction claims as well. Okay, so by way of conclusions, sleep paralysis is a unique altered state of consciousness. Cross-cultural comparisons provide a unique opportunity to assess the interaction between biology and culture and the myriad ways in which this can be reflected in folklore and religious beliefs. And the belief system of the sufferer provides a context for the interpretation of the experience and also influences the actual content of the experience directly. And if you want to read more about it, the best book available is this one by Brian Sharpless and Carl Dogramji. Very good book by Shelley Adler. and not a bad little review chapter by myself and Julia Santamaro. Thanks very much for listening. Thank you.
A minute to spare. Thanks, Chris. I mean, there was a sort of theme for tonight, which was loosely Halloween. So I wasn't actually expecting to go home and be unable to sleep. But I'm sure the last talk on spooky plants is going to cure it all. So that's fine. Do we have any? Is somebody going to be feeding me questions from the WhatsApp group, or I'm going to have to fish them out? Excellent. Well, no. Let's see if we've got any in the room, first of all. And I'm going to hand the mic to Chris, and he can pick them out. Keep your questions brief, because there are people at home and they can't hear you very well. Chris will repeat the question back so that those people can.
Right. Do you want to point to people? There you go.
So you mentioned students and psychiatric population.
Yeah.
Is there anything else driving those sort of inter-individual differences?
Oh, yeah. I mean, for a start, there's a genetic component. I think our group were one of the first to actually establish. I mean, anecdotally, it did seem to run in families, but we actually showed yes, it really does. The factors that I mentioned there, I mean, that list could have gone on. Anything that can disrupt your sleep cycle is likely to trigger an episode if you have the underlying susceptibility. So avoid things like caffeine, alcohol, etc. late at night. I mean, one of the things that really annoys me is there's very, very little research in terms of, well, how do you cope with sleep paralysis if you have it? I've tried to get funding for this and never been successful, And there's two aspects to that. One would be, how can you reduce the frequency of it happening? And secondly, what can you do about it if you are actually in the middle of an experience to try and cope with it. In terms of the first question, sleep hygiene. Just try your best to kind of live a healthy life, get a regular sleep pattern, avoid all those things that might disrupt your sleep at night. Now, I mean, that's easier said than done for some people. If you're a shift worker or a new mother or whatever else it may be, you've got no choice. But, try your best at least. So sleep hygiene would be the main thing. Don't sleep on your back, blah, blah, blah. In terms of what you do, a lot of people actually, when it's happening, realize it is sleep paralysis. And even those people who know all about sleep paralysis, some of them learn to just kind of go with it and enjoy it like a good horror movie. But others say, even though I know it's sleep paralysis, I know it's not real, I can't do anything about the fear. The fear is overwhelming. We really need more research. The other thing, sorry, I've just written a column about this, so it's in my mind, is to get the word out there, particularly to medical professionals, that this is a real thing. Because I get so many people getting in touch saying, I figured out it was probably sleep paralysis. I went and told my doctor about it, and he looked at me as if I was crazy. And that is just so annoying. The other thing is, there is also a thing called exploding head syndrome. Yes, it really does exist, But because it sounds like something like Monty Python, it's taken even less seriously than sleep paralysis. And it's important that people who are suffering from these things get a sympathetic hearing, So I went off the main question, but I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
From the public.
Anecdotally, I have. I'm sorry. Yes, of course. Yes, sorry. The question was: if sleep disturbance is a factor, is sleep paralysis more common in menopausal women or in pregnant women? Anecdotally, I've certainly heard accounts like that. As far as I'm aware, there's not been any systematic research of it, as with so many other questions about sleep paralysis, which is very annoying. But yeah, that would make sense. It would make sense. Oh, that's an excellent question. I almost put that in the talk, but 15 to 20 minutes for a talk. What are you doing to us? Now, there are... Oh, sorry, yes, again, I've forgotten to repeat the question. What's the earliest description of sleep paralysis historically? There are descriptions going back certainly thousands of years. I couldn't give you an estimate. I probably could if I went home and checked it out, but off the top of my head, I can't. I know there's one in kind of Persian literature, and I can't even give you a date for it, I'm afraid, but it was a very, very, very long time ago. And certainly, if you look back throughout, certainly more recent centuries, there have been descriptions. There's also lots of descriptions in fiction. In a lot of people writing fiction were being inspired, presumably, possibly by their own sleep paralysis experiences. So Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, you see these descriptions, you think, that's sleep paralysis. And of course, if we come further forward, so many horror movies are clearly based on episodes of sleep paralysis. But the earliest recorded ones go back a very, very, very long time.
Yeah, we've got quite a few online. So, I'll read the data. I read a while ago, someone was trying to tie declining reports of demonic visitation and increasing reports of alien abduction with sleep paralysis experiences, in that it reflects how we interpret the world with ideas that are prevalent at the time. I'd be fascinated to hear Professor French's opinion on this. You don't have to repeat the whole
No. The question was essentially how much does the kind of current cultural belief systems that are around at the time affect the interpretation, insofar as the questioner believed that there's kind of been a decline in terms of people reporting demons and an increase in people reporting alien abduction. And I think there is certainly some truth in that. I mean, you look at differences. And now, I mean, you can turn this on its head, of course, and say that there really is weird shit happening, and it's just that the way we interpret it, because we can't make sense of it, is in terms of our current kind of belief systems. But I mean, certainly kind of the alien abduction thing, it is all around the world, but it was very much a kind of North American phenomenon, and certainly UK and Europe and so on, because we live in kind of highly technical societies. Whereas if you go back to the Middle Ages, they had belief systems where demons were a real thing, and so if you had one of these weird experiences, the obvious kind of interpretation was, I've been attacked by a demon in the night. I mean, the parallels between the two are amazing, because the idea, I didn't mention this in the talk, but the idea that the demons, the incubus and the succubus, they could be one and the same thing. The succubus, the female version, could attack a male victim, have sex with them, extract sperm, and then turn into an incubus and have sex with a female version, impregnate them, and then you have demonic offspring, which is not too dissimilar to the alien abduction accounts, where there's all this kind of artificial insemination going on and blah, 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 So the parallels are really interesting there.
Is there any research showing sleep paralysis more or less likely if you're sharing events on?
That's an interesting question. Actually, I don't think there is. But there's some interesting kind of observations anecdotally on that, because people who are having these experiences often report that they feel as if they are screaming at the top of their voices, and the person lying next to them in bed just hears, and I mean, one of the ways to try and kind of cope, I mentioned the kind of coping strategies, sometimes your partner can learn the signs you're having one of those do's on you, and if they shake you, that'll wake you up and you're out of it, you're okay. Years back, who remembers Richard and Judy? Oh, come on, some of you. I'm not that old, come on. I did a Richard and Judy, and apparently Judy had a sleep paralysis experience where she kind of was looking at Richard lying next to her in bed, and suddenly he rose up off the bed, levitating like a big vampire. And this was her sleep paralysis experience. So, sometimes your partners can learn to learn to kind of recognize it and help you out of it. Actually, you just reminded me of another, what I thought was a funny story, but I'll probably get stoned off the stage for it. The funniest interpretation, in terms of cultural expectations, etc., of a sleep paralysis episode occurred. I'd done a radio thing, and the driver's driving me home, and he said, "Oh, what were you talking about?" I said, "Oh, this thing called sleep paralysis." And he said, "Oh, I've had that." And he described his episode, and he said his interpretation of this evil presence was that it was his mother-in-law. Now, I know that's 1970s, I know, but but it made sense because he was actually a Cypriot, and within the kind of, the kind of values of his community, you don't have sex before marriage. Now, really, it wasn't his mother-in-law, it was his future mother-in-law. But when he'd had this episode, he'd been in his then girlfriend's parents' bed, having just slept with their daughter. He'd woken up, couldn't move, with an evil sense of presence in the room. So who's it going to be? But again, it made total sense. You interpret what's happening in terms of the belief system you have.
Got one last question in the room.
I have had kind of fairly mild versions of sleep paralysis. And one of my other areas of interest is false memories. And because I've received so many accounts of sleep paralysis, I sometimes think, have I had that? Yeah, I think I've had that. No, I'm pretty sure I've had some. One, for example, involved kind of lying there in bed. It's amazing how often cats crop up a lot in sleep paralysis. My kind of particular episode, I kind of just lying there, and I kind of felt something, I assume the cat, jumping up onto the bed. I go, "Oh, cat's on the bed." And, hang on, cat died 2 years ago. But as I say, so yes, I've had the kind of milder versions. I've never had the kind of full whistles and bells versions. I've had a couple of postgraduate students who've done research on sleep paralysis, but have never themselves actually experienced it. And I kind of mentioned Brian Sharpless there. He's a friend of mine, very, very good researcher. He's done, like I say, co-written the best book around on sleep paralysis. He's never had an episode, and then he did. He was so happy. Okay.
Cheers. Let's complete round of applause.